Imagine being 8 years old, wearing a house key on a shoelace around your neck, and letting yourself into a completely empty home. There is no smartphone to call your mother, no Ring camera watching the porch, and no iPad to distract you from the silence. You are entirely alone. Therefore, you have to figure out how to survive the afternoon on your own. This wasn't a tragedy. It was the standard childhood for 7 million Gen Xers. But this forced independence did something strange to their brains. It created the most misunderstood psychology of any living generation. However, if you think they're just cynical slackers, you've missed the most important part of the story. Because the truth is, Gen X has become the invisible backbone of the modern world. But here's the problem. The very traits that make them successful are also the ones that make them disappear.
Generation X was born between 1965 and 1980, right into a world that was actively falling apart. They inherited the fallout of the Cold War, the stagflation of the 70s, and the explosion of the divorce rate. Their baby boomer parents were busy chasing self-actualization. Therefore, Gen X became the first generation raised by a cult of the adult, rather than a cult of the child. But this neglect wasn't just physical, it was systemic. They watched the Challenger explosion on live TV, saw the Watergate scandal unfold, and witnessed the fumbled response to the AIDS crisis. Every authority figure in their lives proved to be incompetent. However, the world still expected them to follow the rules. This created a generation that stopped believing in fairy tales before they even finished middle school. But here is where everything breaks. Instead of giving up, they built a psychological shield.
Psychologists call this high contingency learning. Because there were no parents around to settle arguments or solve problems, Gen X children learned that every action had a direct, immediate consequence. If you fell off your bike and hit the pavement, no one was there to kiss the wound. You simply got up and washed the gravel out of your palms yourself. Therefore, their brains became wired to think 3 steps ahead to avoid disaster. They aren't pessimists. They are running constant simulations of everything that could go wrong. But this led to a trait called defensive pessimism. They expect the rug to be pulled out because the rug has always been pulled out. They watched their fathers give 30 years to a company, only to receive a pink slip in a 1980s downsizing. Consequently, they developed a work ethic rooted in competence rather than loyalty. They don't care about your fancy job title or your corner office. They only care if you actually know what you are doing. However, this focus on raw skill has turned them into a generation of stealth fighter leaders who do the work without needing the applause. But this independence has created a massive wall between them and the rest of society.
The most fascinating part of the Gen X psyche is their role as the technological bridge. They are the only generation that remembers what it felt like to be genuinely unreachable for hours at a time. They grew up in an analog world of card catalogs and physical mixtapes, but they hit their 20s exactly as the digital revolution exploded. Because their brains were still in a high plasticity window during the rise of the internet, they became digitally bilingual. They can navigate 17 different messaging platforms without anxiety, but they also know how to fix a physical machine with a screwdriver and some WD-40. They are the only people in the room who can translate between a boomer who wants a hierarchy and a Gen Zer who wants total autonomy. But being the natural translator comes with a hidden cost. It is a form of emotional labor that is exhausting because they are constantly absorbing the friction between two worlds. They are the bridge, and bridges don't get parades. They just get walked on. In 2025, Gen X holds a disproportionate 31% of leadership roles, despite being only 20% of the population. They are the stabilizing force in a world addicted to social media performance and viral outrage. But their psychology is a paradox. They are the most independent, yet the most quietly collaborative. They will never ask you for help, because they've been solving their own problems since they were 8 years old. However, if you need help, they are the first to show up, do the job, and leave without posting about it for likes. They value privacy because they remember when an embarrassing mistake didn't live forever on a server. They are the last ones to truly understand the value of being alone with your thoughts. But as the world moves faster toward total digital immersion, this analog intuition is becoming an extinct capability.
Gen X doesn't expect the world to be fair. They just expect themselves to be capable. They are the generation that learned to laugh at the end of the world, so they wouldn't have to scream. But if we lose their perspective, we lose the only people who know how the world worked before it was all behind a screen. They are the backbone, the translators, and the last of the survivors who don't need a trophy to stay motivated. But if you want to understand the people who are actually keeping society running, you have to look at the ones who aren't making any noise. Because Gen X doesn't care if you notice them. They just care that the job gets done. If this hit home for you, or if you finally understand your detached coworker, subscribe for more deep dives into the generational mind.